All right, so I am back with a few more preliminary thoughts about the personal freedom versus economic security topic, and I have about three directions, sort of food for thought for the affirmative, and then I have three for the negative. So, to begin with, I think that on the affirmative, you want to explain to the judge that this is all about a rational adult's ability to voluntarily assume risk. So if there is an adult who doesn't want to have homeowners insurance, we might think that that's an unwise decision, and one house fire or one break-in could leave you bankrupt or even homeless. But some people also think it's an unwise decision to ride a motorcycle or to own and operate a motorcycle, and you certainly wouldn't let your 3-year-old have a motorcycle. At that point, your job as the parent is to keep them safe. But this topic really is a lot about paternalism, and it's about where is the government justified in operating as your parent? And I think you want to use that language quite a bit and say, we're not children, we don't have to be taken care of when the only real danger is a loss of money, so it's inappropriate for the government to play parent in that particular situation. And I think that may be a good way of kind of framing the debate. I think also that you may want to do a little digging into some of the things that are written about commercial speech and about how there should be protection for business operators who are selling things, and sometimes regulators get a little overzealous in calling something fraudulent. And I think you'll find some of the people who go very hard in the direction of free speech, they say that really people ought to have the opportunity in a marketplace to hear about all kinds of products, even if a very cautious and prudent regulator thinks that the claims are inflated or exaggerated or the product is unsafe. I think you'll find people making in kind of detailed fashion, and maybe with some very good examples, exactly the arguments you want to make. And in my brief little sort of skimming over where that literature is right now, there are a surprising number of people writing about commercial speech and how there should be a lot more freedom to sell and advertise your product, and they're talking in particular about investments, and they're talking about financial instruments. And I think that you could probably get some really, really good examples of some sort of investment that a regulator thought shouldn't be allowed at all or shouldn't be advertised because it was unwise, but it later turned out to be something that was the few people who got into it became very, very wealthy. So the regulation of commercial speech, I think, may be a way you do a little research, you'll come up with some good arguments. The last thing I think that I would do if I were you on the affirmative is I would make the argument that you have to be doubly vigilant and you have to be doubly suspicious of any incursion on your personal freedom that seems benign. You have to, this is one of the classic arguments against paternalism, that things that seem as though they are protective, things that seem as though they have a good motive, those are the most dangerous incursions on your freedom of all because they enlist you. They make you a willing participant in the stripping away of what you ought to be able to do. They make you a willing participant in giving away your power to the government. And so I think that's a way into the debate that you ought to say that that freedom in this area in particular ought to be valued above that which endangers it because this freedom in particular could so easily be lost. Now, some ideas on the negative. I think that you sort of want to make the mirror image of that argument, that maybe the way you describe it to your judge is to think about all the different freedoms that we think are important. Freedom of speech, the right to vote, the right to participate in politics, the right to assemble and protest, possibly the right to bear arms, the right to choose your career, the right to marry who you choose. Go through several of those, the right to worship, and then say, where in that list of priorities do you put the right to go bankrupt? The right to be such a silly person that you let your house burn down and you don't have any insurance. That's got to go at the bottom of the sort of list of things that we defend and protect and think of as very important bulwarks against government interference. It's really important that we not let the government limit our ability to speak on matters of public interest. It's really important that the government not interfere in the choice of where we worship or what career we choose. It's not really that important that the government stay out of our right to go bankrupt, that the government stay out of our right to starve to death. Those are kind of low importance rights, and I think you could say that here's kind of, I guess this gets on into the second thing that I think you can do on the negative. This is a little bit of an overstretch, it's going to be interesting to see if affirmatives will let you get away with this, but you can set the ground up tilted in your direction a little bit if you say freedom, the way the topic is phrased, there's nothing in it that limits it to discussions of government interference. Freedom is surrendered by any obligation that you take on. And I think you could probably characterize it to a lot of your judges by saying, if you're a parent of a child, you are not free. You've given up a lot of your freedom because you've become responsible for that child. So therefore, if you're part of a community, part of a neighborhood, part of an extended family, if you feel any obligation to come to the assistance of those folks, if you feel that there are some things you shouldn't do that are unwise risks and you have an obligation to steer clear of them because it would create a burden on them, then that is as much a surrendering of your freedom as if the government passed a law saying it was illegal for you to engage in such unwise actions. Now, I think that affirmatives ought to come roaring back and say that personal freedom really is a trigger, that we're talking about the political arena, and if you talk about any sort of relational context as being a surrender of freedom, then the affirmative is left with no ground at all. But if you can get the affirmative to let you get away with that, then you argue that any time people get together to help their neighbors, that is an example of protecting economic security at the cost of maybe giving up some of your freedom. And therefore, on the negative, you can say that it becomes the affirmative's burden to say that that's a bad thing, that everybody should just abandon one another to sink or swim. And I think you can make the affirmative look very unsympathetic if you can sort of frame it that way. The last thing I think I would do if I were you is do some reading up on the whole subprime mortgage affair that went down over the past 2 or 3 years. And I think what you'll find is that a lot of people, they rationalized what they did. A lot of the people selling subprime mortgages to people who didn't qualify for them, they rationalized what they did by saying, let the buyer beware. The documents that I gave them had all the terms in them. But you'll find some fairly detailed explanations that these instruments were defective from the get-go, and if the regulations on the market had been operating properly, and some of the new regulations have sealed up and ruled out those kinds of instruments, then there are a lot of people who would still have their homes today. And then I think you can put a human face on this topic, and you can speak to your judge and say, was the right to not understand this mortgage that you were entering into and then to lose your home, was that an important enough right that a properly functioning marketplace would have been an inappropriate incursion on that freedom? So those are some directions I think you can take on both sides of the topic, on the affirmative and on the negative, sort of positioning yourself and defining your ground on both sides, and some directions to go for where to find some research-based material to flesh out your side of the topic. So good luck.